In this chapter, we will focus on line and shape, two of the most fundamental building blocks of visual art. Everything we see in art begins with these elements. Why do you think artists start with line before color or texture? Think of a art piece and describe what lines do you immediately notice when you look at it. Henri Matisse has said, remember, a line cannot exist alone. It always brings a companion along. Do remember that one line does nothing. It is only relation to another that it creates a volume. Matisse reminds us that lines gain meaning through relationships. A single line does very little on its own. It's how line interacts that creates form and space. How might one line change meaning when placed next to another? And what do you think Matisse means by one line does mean nothing? In art, a line is a moving dot. Unlike math, lines in art can be emotional, expressive, and symbolic. Can a line show emotion? How? Identify different types of lines you see in everyday life. Let's also look at this photograph, okay? This photograph captures Picasso drawing with light. The line is created through motion and time, reminding us that line doesn't have to be permanent. Looking at this, how is this different from a drawn line on paper? What role does movement play in creating this line? The measure of line refers to its length and width. When a line becomes wide enough, it can begin to function as a shape. At what point does a line stop being a line and become a shape? Here, in this art piece, thick layered lines dominate the composition. Their width gives them visual weight and presence. Compare this to Picasso's light drawing from earlier. How does thickness change impact? How does the width of the line affect mood? These precise pencil lines in this piece here emphasize control and intentionality. The measured quality creates a quiet, contemplative feeling. How does precision affect emotional response? In this installation, line becomes immersive. The viewer physically moves through the line. Imagine, how does experiencing line in this kind of space change the meaning? Lines can be straight, curved, jagged, smooth, thick, or thin. Each quality communicates a different feeling. Which line type feels the most energetic to you? Why? In this piece by Frank Hurley, the strong diagonals created by the ship and the ice convey a sense of danger and tension. When you analyze or look at this piece, how do the diagonal lines affect stability? You can also compare how would this image feel if the lines were changed differently. Actual lines physically exist. Implied lines are created when our eyes connect the elements. Um, can you think of an implied line without a drawn line? Here in figure 2.6, Gilliam's draped canvas emphasizes physical, actual line created by folds and gravity. How does material that you use create line? Now, figure 2.8 is a little bit different. Um, this piece, when we look at it, the gazes of the figures lead our eyes across the painting, which creates implied lines. All right. Where does your eye travel first when you look at this painting? We're still looking at the same painting from the previous slide, but here psychological line connects figures conceptually rather than visually. What story do these connections suggest? Horizontal lines suggest calm, while vertical lines suggest strength, and diagonal lines suggest movement. Which direction feels most unstable to you? An outline is an actual line. Outlines define the edges or defines edges. Contour actually suggests a form without hard edges. If we were to look at two different pieces, which we will, which would feel more realistic to you? So, Figure 2.10 is a very well known piece, The Birth of Venus, okay? Um, Here we have the clear outlines which create idealized decorative figures, okay? Now we're going to compare this to the next slide, which is Mona Lisa's softer contours. We all know what this painting is. Figure 2.11 is the Mona Lisa, okay? Um, Leonardo has used contour lines to create soft transition and realism in this painting, okay? When we look at this, how does the softness affect mood? Here with figure 2.12, we're going to look at something different than the previous two slides. The contour lines in photography here rely on light and shadow rather than the drawn edges that we saw with the Mona Lisa and the birth of Venus. Okay, how does light replace line here? Chiaroscuro, or modeling, creates the illusion of three dimensionality through gradations of light and shade. Artists use line density to create value and volume, and this can be done by line patterns like cross hatching, like crisscross lines, or stippling, which is like the pattern of dots, and hatching, which is closely spaced parallel lines. Here in this art piece by Kaufman, the delicate line variation creates depth and form. How does the line control create realism with this? In this figure, the bold lines here create strong shape and social presence. When you look at this piece, what message does this style and the lines communicate? Now we're going to look at the shape, form, volume, and mass of art pieces, okay? So, shape is flat, form is three dimensional, mass refers to physical weight. Um, can a flat image feel heavy? In slides 23 through 28, we are going to compare and contrast these art pieces. All right, so these examples show how geometric shapes can create physical and symbolic mass. So when you look at these pieces, I would like for you to compare ancient pyramids with modern glass pyramids, and then also judge which one feels more stable or powerful. Starting in slide 29 through 31, we are going to talk about geometric shapes, more like geometric shapes in art, okay? So, geometric shapes may be derived from mathematical formulas and are rendered with great precision. You can remember this by geometric shapes as in geometry, which is math, okay? So, we're going to think like rectangles, circles, diamonds, rhombus, those type of geometric shapes, okay? Um, and so geometric shapes can feel controlled, ordered, and precise. All right. When we look at these next slides, 29 through 31, I want you to see where you would find these images or these pieces in modern designs. Now that we've looked at art pieces of geometric shapes, we are now going to talk about the opposite, which is organic shapes. All right, so organic shapes feel natural, irregular, and fluid. They are derived from the world of living things. Okay, when we are going through slides 32, 33, and 34, compare organic architecture to the geometric buildings that you see. Now we're going to talk about non objective and abstract shapes, okay? Abstract shapes come from reality, and non objective shapes don't. So when we go into slide 36, we're going to look and see if the meaning disappears without the recognizable object. So let's look at figure 2.26. At first glance, this painting might look confusing. You might not immediately see a clear person riding a bicycle, and that was actually intentional, okay? Bachani breaks the figure and the bicycle into overlapping shapes, sharp angles, and swirling lines to create the feeling of movement. Many of the shapes that you see are abstract and non objective. This means they don't directly represent a specific object the way realistic art does. So instead of carefully painting a recognizable cyclist, Bachani uses fragmented shapes and energetic forms to suggest motion and energy. So think about if you wouldn't have known the title, the dynamism of a cyclist, would you have known this was a person riding a bicycle? Amorphous shapes resist definition and create ambiguity. And ambiguity means something that is unclear or open to more than one interpretation, so that way the viewer may not immediately understand exactly what they are seeing. Look at this figure here. In 3D by Judy Path, many of the forms appear irregular, organic, and undefined, which makes them amorphous. Okay? And I want you to ask yourself, how is this artwork different from the traditional sculpture that we usually see? In two-dimensional compositions, a shape is referred to as a figure and the empty area around it is referred to as ground. So, positive shapes are figures, negative shapes are ground. Let's look at slide 40 and 41. Okay, both use figure ground relationships differently, and I want you to compare and contrast. Does each artist use space? So in slide 40, Degas shows working class women ironing clothes in a quiet, everyday moment. Okay, this painting focuses on labor, fatigue, and realism, highlighting the physical work of laundresses in the 19th century Paris. Whereas Gauguin also depicts women doing laundry, but in his painting, he uses bold colors, simplified shapes, and a more decorative style. This scene is less about realism and more about color, design, and artistic expression. So now that we have looked at Degas' art piece and Gauguin's art piece and compared and contrasted them, and they had a lot of similarities, let's look at Adolphus's work here too. What I want you to do is I want you to notice the similarities that you see in all three, and then I also want you to look at the differences. Obviously, with Adolphus, he is more of a modern artist. He uses modern photography, but I want you to look at the all three and do a compare and contrast. A figure ground reversal occurs when the viewer's focus shifts from figure to ground and back again. Okay, figure ground reversal challenges the perception. When we look at this figure 2.32, when does the figure become ground? And why is this visually engaging? Let's look at figure 2.33. This image shows an advertisement for Coca Cola featuring its famous contour bottle on a sign in Beijing, China. We can use this image to understand a design principle called the figure ground reversal. Okay. In visual design, the figure, as I stated before, is the main object we focus on, while the ground is the background behind it. Normally, our eyes could clearly separate these two. So, for example, we might see the Coca Cola bottle as the figure and the background of the sign as the ground. However, in the figure ground reversal, the viewer's perceptions can switch. The background may suddenly appear to be the main shape, while the object we thought was the figure becomes the background. Let's also look at figure 2.34, okay? In this visual perception, the figure is the main element that we focus on, which is the Apple logo, while the ground is the background surrounding it. In this image, many viewers immediately see the Apple logo because it's the focal point of the structure. However, with the design of the glass cube, it creates an interesting visual situation because the walls are transparent. The surrounding city environment, the sky, buildings, and reflections become part of the background that constantly changes. All right, so this does create moments of figure ground reversal where our perception shifts between what we see as the main object and what we see as the background. So, for example, sometimes the Apple logo feels like the main figure floating inside the cube. Other times, the glass cube itself becomes the figure, while the city behind it becomes the ground. Okay, so let's also look at this poster by Nico from the film Che, Now and Forever. This is a figure ground reversal occurs because the image of Che Guevara is created through the contrast of positive and negative shapes. At first, the viewer sees Che Guevara's face as the figure while the surrounding color acts as the ground. However, because the image relies heavily on bold silhouettes and negative space, the eye can shift between seeing the portrait and seeing the background shapes that form it. This visual switching between figure and background creates figure ground reversal, making the design more visually engaging and memorable. Lastly, let's look at the Hope poster by Shepard Fairey. The Hope poster is featuring President Barack Obama. The portrait is created using bold areas of color and simplified shapes. The viewer sees Obama's face as the figure, while the colored areas behind it act as the ground. Because the image is made with flat shapes and strong contrast, our eyes can shift between noticing the face and noticing the colored shapes that create it. This use of figure ground reversal makes the design simple, powerful, and easy to recognize.